Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Seán Hogan is my name, from Tipperary. I'm going to speak, and could I thank Knocklong History, Heritage and Tourism Group here for the invitation to speak to you this morning, to speak in Tipperary's place in that period, the Great War. I have to say, Patsy, before I start, may I wish you and your team well with the project that you have set out for us last night. I think it really is an interesting and exciting project, and you've been thinking about it. And I think what you're doing here in terms of gathering is a great opportunity and almost unique in this Pan-Munster piece, so I congratulate you and wish you well on that. Without further ado, we'll proceed on the Tipperary one. Now, before we start, of course, I have to claim here as Tipperary was the brand during the First World War. I'm going to take a little bit of time this morning, within Patsy's constraint of looking back at the war as distinct from soldiers in the War of Independence, to paint in a little bit of the background here, which will hopefully help the other speakers today as well. But I do have to claim that Tipperary was the brand during the Great War. And the song, many of you will be familiar with it, I suppose, was written before in 1912, a little ditty for the music halls. But it took off, the soldiers really took to it, and they took off, and all the troops from Canada and Australia and everywhere else sang the song. So Tipperary was well known as the place. So what I want to do, though, is look beyond the song and into the connections of Tipperary with the British Army during the war. I want to look at a couple of facets of the Great War: recruitment, casualties, and the whole issue of conscription, and how that changed, in my view, everything in Tipperary. And then once we get after the war, ex-soldiers who joined the IRA, ex-soldiers in the Crown's forces, and ex-soldiers who became civilians. And just look at some people as exemplars. And I put this map of Tipperary up because while Tipperary may pride itself on being sort of a revolutionary kind of place and starting the War of Independence and all that, Tipperary had very strong connections with the British Army. There was very major barracks in Clonmel, in Tipperary town, in Templemore, and we had Borough on the northern edge, and we had Limerick as well. So these were very significant presences, and the British Army was a very significant presence in Tipperary. Just in terms of some sources, there's a couple of books that I suppose really, John Denny's In Time of War is a great one, so a lot of what I'm speaking to here is other people's research. Turtle Bunbury is some great material in there about some Tipperary men. Tom and Ruth Burnell have done the definitive study looking at people with Tipperary connections who died in the war. My own work in North Tipperary as well. Plus there's a lot of other sources as well. I just leave those with people because there are other sources here too that are worth picking up on this. These were the barracks. We had regimental headquarter barracks in Tipperary, Richmond in Templemore, which is now the Garda Training College, the Victoria Barracks in Clonmel, which I think is closed, and in Tipperary town, being late into the barracks period, but the strong barracks there as well. But you also had smaller barracks and camps in Nina, Feather, Cahir, Carrickshire. And these weren't so much garrisons as large-scale bases for the army by the time we're talking about 1913-14, by that time. The social aspects are worth reflecting on. You had rotating UK regiments, as well as the Royal Irish and the Munsters and Leinsters and Connaught, all had bases in or around, certainly, Tipperary. The traditional composition of an Irish regiment, you had your officers were the Anglo-Irish families, and they have to be seen very much in that context. They were the officers on everything from generals down. Soldiers were the lower classes then, the men made up the numbers. But you did have real experience of war. The Crimean War, 1855, I think the Boer War, of people from Tipperary fighting in those wars. And there was the economic aspect of a barracks in the town, big barracks, and the social interactions. Among the officer class, you had hunting, shooting, fishing, and tennis with the gentry. They were all sort of interlinked. The soldiers were, I suppose, confined to the pubs. And Des Burnand has done a study in Tipperary town, and over a 20-year period, there's probably about an average of 4 marriages between soldiers and local women in the registered each year. So there was interaction, social interaction happening. The Home Rule crisis was the start of things kicking off. And Ireland was heading towards civil war at that stage over this, and you had the Ulster people importing UVF, importing their weapons. I mention General Sir Hubert Gough because he's man with both Lisnagry and Tipperary connections. Family were from Clonmel. He was involved in the Curragh Mutiny, led perhaps the Curragh Mutiny. But in his later career in the army, he was also the OC of the 5th Army, which was overrun by the Germans in March 1918. So it didn't really have a good war after as a thing, but one of the Tipperary officers who were involved. Nationalist Ireland, we had the volunteers. The connection there was a lot of the British Army NCOs were the instructors for the Irish volunteers, certainly in Tipperary. Now, the volunteers were late starting in Tipperary, which indicates to me that Redmond and these people were absolutely in control of politics in Tipperary at the time. So it was full 6 months after the volunteers were found. Then we had the sudden outbreak of the European War. The UK declared war in Germany. And this gave rise to huge impact in Tipperary at the time. It was mobilisation of the army and call-up of all the reservists. And there was thousands of soldiers in Tipperary. And you had this spectacle of trainloads of troops and horses. The horses were being rounded up from day one. The fairs, all the industry in Tipperary, they went to the breweries, took the horses, put them on the trains and sent them off to the war, all in the first week. This all happened in that first week of August 1914. And the descriptions are quite extraordinary, really, of what was happening. But the interesting thing about it, the parades of soldiers at the railway stations were led by the Irish volunteers, were led by people like Frank Seán in Clonmel, about 500 volunteers marching with the people going. So, and you had, I suppose, thousands, and this is a picture in my own town, Nina, of people marching off, volunteers marching off to join the British Army. You had the whole military machine being wound up, and intense excitement and anxiety in mixture prevailed, was the phrase. On the home front, John Denny does a very good job on this, for any of you who are interested in this. The idea was that the volunteers, Ulster and Irish volunteers, would defend Ireland's shore initially, and there was harmony, apparently, between Unionists and Nationalists in Tipperary over this idea, and some very interesting correspondence on that. There was very, very few, I would say, in Tipperary opposed to Redmond in this early stage of the war. There was all the support societies that, again, a lot of the gentry women would have been involved in establishing, and everybody got involved, and they were knitting for the troops at the front, and they were doing all kinds of things. And the picture in John Denny's book is Limerick Junction railway station, where there was, thousands of troops on the railways on the move, where they set up a buffet so the troops could get a cup of tea and a cut of bread as they passed through. They were standing there waiting for trains connecting Waterford and going all over the place. So, and that was kept going for a significant portion of the war, that particular piece. And the impact in Ireland would have been the stories of the Belgian refugees arriving and the terrible atrocities of the Hun. This is a famous picture of Templemore priest, Father Francis Gleeson, blessing the Munsters. It features a lot in the media just at the moment as we're speaking. But it wasn't just the troops went, you had medical doctors, lots of doctors in Tipperary, lots of the priests all went as chaplains as well. Just briefly go on just to paint in this one. Clonmel's 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Regiment, part of the British Expeditionary Force to France. And the 14th of August, they crossed from Southampton to Boulogne and moved up towards the Belgian city of Mons, where they encountered the Germans. And according to Miles Dungan, and I'm only saying this now, Tim, I know it was a dispute last year about who started the War of Independence and whether the Kerry lads fired the first shots or not. But Miles Dungan says that it was a Tipperary man fired first at the Germans from the British Expeditionary Force here. This man, Corporal Edward Thomas, fired the first shots in the morning when they encountered them. So I'm not sure the Tipperary fellas should be let out that much. They're dangerous in starting these wars, I'm afraid. But of course the war was this British Expeditionary Force. Hundreds of Tipperary men involved in that and across. But of course quickly and immediately the first casualties, Private Stephen Coffey from my own part of the country, a place called Carney. Stephen was maybe aged about 40, involved in the Land and Labour Association, things like that. Quit the farming, he was farm labourer, quit that, went off, joined the Leinsters in Burr and was killed in the month of October, soon after the thing started. But of course it wasn't just the labouring classes, all classes. This is a photo of the Denallys, or the Pretties, the coming of age picture of the young officer there, FRD, Reginald Pretty, son of Lord and Lady Denally. He was killed in the first year. The Gills of Fateen, again, would have been prosperous, I suppose, really Irish. Their son was killed. John Esmond, the MP for Dromina, was a doctor, died of medical condition. Robert Brownlow, one of the RIC men. He had 5 sons who were in the British Army. One of them was killed in that first going off. And every week, I could have brought the Nina Guardian, and they're reprinting every week. The reports are coming in of people being killed. So from an early stage, there was casualties. So there was when people were going off, they knew what was happening out there. Recruitment campaigns, starting, I suppose, really, there was an initial, lots of people joining up, but then it began to tail off, and the army were looking for lots of recruits, and there was a big effort put into all the meetings, and huge numbers. It's difficult to put a precise estimate, but I think the figures for Tipperary are probably over 10,000 people from Tipperary in the British Army in this particular period, which is phenomenal. The population of Tipperary is about 150,000 at the time, about 10,000 people. And out of towns like Nina, you had, a town population a little over 5,000. Before the end of the war, you had 1,200 people joined from Nina and the area, were in the British Army, or had been in the Army or the services at that stage. So huge impact. And I think that's really forgotten just how big the actual impact is. It was the labouring classes and not the farmers' sons, and that was a big issue. Peaked in July 1915 and declined thereafter. There was another recruitment drive in October, November 1919. Again, we're just into May now, but in April you had the start of the campaign in Gallipoli, and there was a hell of a lot of criticism started in the Irish papers about what had happened in Gallipoli, about committing troops, and they were slaughtered and all that sort of stuff. But interestingly enough, soon after that criticism began to appear in public, people began to talk about VCs, and the first VC was for an Irish soldier was to Michael O'Leary of Clonmel for his actions. And again, James Summers in Cloughjordan, these are photos of all the bigwigs, generals down in Cloughjordan presenting the VC. But clearly in my mind this was connected with the criticism of the military authority and the recruitment drives. And in fact, Michael O'Leary features in a big recruitment poster, the first VC, you can win one as well too. So I think I'm safe in claiming that, really. The social impacts of the war, price rises. The war was great for the farmers. The price of horses went up, but they weren't keen on having the horses go, but everything else went up as well. Food went up. But it was obviously bad for the working classes, if I put it that way, because they were under pressure. Their wages remained the same. The price of eggs and butter and potatoes and everything all went up. Flour, all the things. There was talk of food scarcity during the war at different stages, and Sinn Féin got in on that. The farmers' sons were staying out of the towns in case they'd get recruited or get drunk and maybe join up and go off. There was many cases of that. We had the prisoners in Templemore. There was a group of conscientious objectors, I think, were cutting down woods over in East Tipperary, were brought there, were working, heard a story about that. We had the issue of separation money and being paid to the wives of the soldiers who were away in the war, and there was issues, gave rise to a number of issues, and drinking and neglect of children and stuff like that. There was reports of gangs of children involved in robberies throughout the period here, and kids being sent away to the institutions, the Borstal kind of institutions. And one of particular interest to myself, given my professional background, the cold winter of 1916-1917 started on the same day as it did in 2010, 27th of November 1916. The cold set in and lasted right through, and again added to the hardship of the labouring classes, trying to keep warm, trying to get fuel at that time. It's a picture of kids bringing in sticks around Nina, bringing sticks back into the town. Then you had this strange business in Dublin, the insurrection, IRB led, flagging a couple of Tipperary connections. There was a district inspector in Nina called Ivan Henry Price, and he was seconded into the army as intelligence officer, and he was working in Dublin Castle when the Irish Citizen Army appeared at the gate. And he heard the shots after they shot the policeman from Limerick here, the DMP man from Limerick. And when the Citizen Army people came through the gate, Price went down. He was the one with the revolver who fired in them and drove them back out, or at least he fired at them, and they retreated. So I suppose therein saved Dublin Castle. The interesting about him, 3 weeks before that, he'd had a telegram say his son had been killed in France as well. So was killed in just at the end of March there. The other Tipperary connection But 1916, a young chap from Upper Church had gone to Canada with his brothers, had joined the Canadian forces, had been sent to England on his way to France, had come back over to Dublin to meet his mother, and somehow got caught up in the thing and was killed. So he's the only Tipperary connection as far as I know. There may have been one or two others, but he's the other one. The last one, of course, was the Thomas MacDonagh connection. MacDonagh was from Cloughjordan. He was one of the 7 signatories who was executed in the first batch on the 3rd of May. And you had some arrests in South Tipperary, but very little, really. And there was a big change in public sentiment came about. I know that's a gallop through that, but there's a lecture in that in itself. Arming, the New Irish Volunteers were established in 1917, and in parallel to the development of Sinn Féin, and Thomas Ashe's funeral was a seminal moment in all that. But the British Army is the connection here. The purchase of weapons from the soldiers home and leave was their main source of things. But of course, between £3 and £6 was the going price for a revolver to a rifle, and rising £3 to £6 was not easily done back then for the volunteers. So of course they changed strategy and started to steal the rifles. Of course that gave rise to its own problems. In silver mines on 1st of January 1918, 3 local volunteers went into a house and killed the pensioner, which didn't go down well either, you know, one of these cases, and gave rise to trials and all that kind of thing. So it didn't always quite work out as they had planned. The volunteers collected shotguns from the farmers and did some raids on the gentry, but a lot of the gentry had already put their guns into storage. The conscription crisis was huge in Tipperary. My study of Tipperary, this was a huge issue, completely changed. Now, the people who had been opposed to the war, opposed to whatever, Sinn Féin had become the dominant piece, but it really was the issue to turn Tipperary into, I suppose, the really, how would I put it, revolutionised place that it became, and which gave rise to the start of the war. Radicalised, yes. Sinn Féin was positioned to lead opposition, wiped out the parliamentary party, joined everyone, the clergy, all those that would have kept a million miles away from them previously. The volunteers went into overdrive, collecting weapons of every kind and making weapons. Seán McLaughlin, ex-Citizen Army, young fellow from inner city, came to Tipperary and established the Sinn Féin structure. And the irony of that, of course, was he would have been quite left-wing, quite whatever. He couldn't. His big job was to keep the volunteers in Tipperary from getting involved in land issues. They were going to sort out the land stuff, and he was trying to keep them structured and focused on, what they were trying to do. So, interesting choice for volunteer headquarters to send him to Tipperary. But what it did do, and all this, it brought forth subversive activity. So you had all these young fellas going around doing all this subversive activity, but completely supported by the community. So the business of being on the run and staying out of the way of the police was learned from March 1918 on, before the shots were actually fired and before the whole thing started. So I would contend in Tipperary the background was really done at that stage. The army were back on the streets, the British Army, in support of the police in that time, because the police were confined to their barracks for fear of attack. And then came, at the end of 1918, the conclusion of the war. Huge numbers of casualties here. Burnell identifies 1,415 dead who had either Tipperary addresses or their next of kin were in Tipperary. Now, that doesn't just mean the British Army, that would include Australian, Canadian forces and US forces as well, that he has perused. The end of the war also brought the Spanish flu epidemic, and there was issues about sexually transmitted disease and medical issues at the time as well too in some of the papers in Tipperary. And of course you had the loss of prosperity that came at the end of the war, and soldiers returning to unemployment. If you had 10,000 soldiers went, some of the national estimates suggested at least half those came back in that first sort of year. So you're looking at maybe 5,000 people coming back into Tipperary looking for work or looking for their jobs back, if they had jobs. But it wasn't plain sailing for them, and the original Dr. Esmond, his son, had won the by-election in 1915. He'd continued on in the war, but when the victory parade was held in Dublin in July 1919, Lieutenant Esmond held an alternative meeting in the Mansion House with several thousand people protesting about employment for soldiers. So his political career was well on the way there, and that one leading into that particular area. So unemployment is a big issue for people coming back. But the context had been set for Sinn Féin's sweeping election victory. The outgoing MPs on the left there and the incoming Sinn Féin TDs. Esmond went, replaced by Joseph McDonagh, brother of Tom McDonagh. John Hackett went, replaced by Seamus Burke, who became Minister for Local Government in the first Cosgrave government. John Cullen, in the latter two there was a contest. PJ Maloney defeated John Cullen and Pierce McCann defeated TJ Condon. And again, exciting times, I would say, at the end of 1918 in Tipperary. Now, moving on, in terms of soldiers joining the Republicans, you had 3 Tipperary IRA brigades. Some ex-soldiers joined local IRA companies. But I was trying to get some figures on this in preparing for this, but I'm inclined to the view that the ex-soldiers were more urban-based. They were working-class people from the towns. And the IRA in Tipperary were probably more of a rural sort of based. And I'm not sure that the two, and a couple of the people I would have interviewed in the 80s would have spoken to that team about not trusting people in around the towns, because I thought they were too much connected and too, just too easy for stuff to be getting back to the police. And I'm sure it must have been a worry for the British Army. I mean, if you think about what happened in the rest of Europe, there was a lot of revolution, a lot of things happened, but a lot of it caused by soldiers who went back after the war. I mean, think of the Russian Revolution being the classic point of it. And I'm sure the British must have been worried about, thousands of soldiers coming back into Tipperary and into other counties. Would these join the IRA? But I don't think they did. But one of the people I interviewed in the 80s was Lieutenant General M.J. Costello, who founded the Air and Foods and Irish Sugar and all that sort of stuff. But he was quite dismissive of the soldiers, and one of his comments was, he said, just the fact that we're in the British Army didn't make that they were great soldiers. A lot of them were in logistics jobs and various other things. And his comment was, I knew some of them, he says, and they wouldn't hit the parish they were born in. He says, well, if we gave them a rifle. That's what he said about them. And he used that in criticism, in fact, of Frank McGrath, the OC of No. 1 Tipperary Brigade. Their first operation, one of their first big operations, was attacking Borsican Barracks, and he put ex-soldiers in critical positions to keep fire on the windows. But of course, it ended up that several of the IRA men were actually shot by friendly fire and the stuff. It was that gave rise to that particular comment, that particular incident. No soldiers emerged as Tipperary IRA leaders. There was a few prominent ones. Seán Glennon, the No. 1 Tipperary Brigade, when the active service unit was being formed in October 1920, he trained them, put them through their paces and movements and all that, and he was a section leader in the thing. Now, he had a big clash with the Brigade OC, who would not have been a professional soldier, over positions in the Modrini ambush, which is a very interesting kind of story, but it's one we could give today talking about as well. But so he, from his professional experience and opinion, he didn't agree at all with the disposition, and he withdrew his section and in fact exposed the entire ambush. Could have turned into a shambles from the IRA perspective, and had he not withdrawn, casualties for the RSC would have been much worse. Jim Gorman, quite a famous character, was in the Australian forces, I think deserted from France, and came back to, he was from Australia, or living in Australia certainly, came back to his relations up overhead Hollyford, back Kilcommon side up there, and he got involved in the No. 3 Brigade and was involved in setting up the first ASU in the No. 3 Brigade. Again, was involved in a controversial clash at the Thomastown ambush. By clash, I mean within the IRA. The second place where soldiers appeared was in relation to reinforcing the police. The early attacks on the police we heard about last night from John Connors here at Salahead Beg and in Limerick and on into Knocklong, why we're here in Knocklong. So they were the early IRA attacks, but the government policy at the time was to have a political, not a military response. They didn't want to use soldiers or bring soldiers onto the streets in Ireland. So they were going to reinforce the RIC, and they've been talking about this for some time. So the decision was to reinforce the RIC with soldiers, and these were the posters, the kind of posters that were put up and advertising the work. So the first Black and Tans arrived in Tipperary probably in around March 1920. And very soon after they arrived, I suppose, shades of things to come, the county inspector of the RIC and the district inspector were investigating the killing of James Mccarthy and Tom Dwyer, which took place these were men who were shot at night by people who visited them. Now that took place a week after Thomas Mccarthy was shot in Cork. And James Mccarthy, there's a Knocklong connection here. He was the IRA volunteer from Thurles who was on the train which came into Knocklong. He left Thurles with the prisoner Hogan on the train, and he was on the signal. And I would say that story was widely known back in Thurles, and when the two RIC men turned up to shoot him, they looked for him and they shot him, and I think it was straightforward settling of scores, really. But the point I make about it, the county inspector at the time and the district inspector really went after these guys. They seized the books in the barracks, they looked at the ammunition distribution to try and nail who had actually carried out the shootings here. So serious stuff, but clearly there was disciplinary issues arising and going to arise there. The recruitment offices were in the UK, but the demographics of the Crown Forces in North Tipperary, and this is one perhaps worth looking at. On the 1st of January 1919, you had 199 RIC men, and these are original RIC men, as I call them. They were from Galway, Roscommon, Cork and Kerry, were the ones who were based in Tipperary. All old stagers, being in the RIC, had their career as policemen. Shrewd operators, I have to say. Whatever else you think about them, these guys knew their community, they understood what was going on. In the early days, any crime, they were on top of it. But go on 2 years then, the 1st of January 1921, you had 434 RIC men in North Tipperary, of whom 122 were originals, so the number had dropped. You had 309 recruited after the 1st of January 1920, but the figure that wouldn't be widely known, 40% of those were young Irishmen. They weren't the scum of the English jails, or they weren't necessarily ex-soldiers. They were young Irishmen who had joined from all over the country and who had joined and were posted to Tipperary. And one of them, I interviewed this man called Robert Crossett from Tyrone. I interviewed him in the 80s. And he had survived that Madrini ambush, and very interesting things to say. Soldiers were in specialist roles as well too. Barrack attacks were a feature throughout 1920, and ex-officers were recruited as what were called defence of the barrack sergeants. And they had no role in policing except to strengthen the barrack defences and take charge of the defence in the event of an IRA attack. And this is a sketch widely done of the attack in Rear Cross Barracks in July 1920, and shows Sergeant Stokes. When he heard the IRA men battering on the roof, he came out with his rifle to fire up at them or to have a look, see what was going on, and the IRA men covering the door there shot him, and he was killed. John Stokes, he was 23, he was a classic ex-officer, had been served as a lieutenant in France, was from Newry and was buried in Newry. His father was a Justice of the Peace in Newry. The Army's role during the War of Independence. Initially, they said they were in support of the police. Then you had these special military areas were used as a technique for controlling population. In the Tipperary case, they were in as good as the Black and Tans and the retaliations. There was questions in the House of Commons and soldiers' involvement in burning Newport Creamery in July 1920. And interestingly enough, the reason they did burn the creamery was because a woman had had her hair cut, her hair shorn by the local IRA over, I suppose, keeping company with the soldiers at the time, but they retaliated and burned the creamery. The creamery burnings had just started, and that became a big issue in Tipperary, big economic one. You had martial law after December 1920, and that enabled the troops obviously to operate on their own. One of the interesting things that was most really about it, that I would say, what happened, you had an alignment of military and ex-military officers who were leading all branches of the Crown Forces in Tipperary, and I think that was a real help to their coordination. You had the county inspector of the RIC, again was Captain James MacDonald, ex-army, had served his time in the army, had been in the police, went into the army, came back into the police and became county inspector. You had the auxiliaries were all ex-officers, and you had the military officers. So you had three sets of military officers effectively running the Crown Forces, which I think is something always worth bearing in mind. The overall reputation of the army, many of the people that you'll see about, a lot of the soldiers weren't that pushed about the job that they were doing. Lots of IRA men got away on them and got through checkpoints and stuff like that. They were searched and were able to blag their way through, in comparison to the police, I think. But there were IRA attacks on the army, and they had casualties and they did have retaliations. I'm just picking a couple of the attacks. There was an ambush at Thomastown. If we go back out, we were going from Tipperary back to Cashel on Northamptonshire Regiment, who were based in Templemore. 3 were killed, including a Private Crummy, who I'm told was from Newport, in fact. So you still had local people joining the army at the time. So he was a Tipperary man, was killed in that ambush, serving in the British Army at the time. Templemore was burned in retaliation, including the town hall in Templemore, and Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Beattie of Dublin died in injuries from the fire. Some controversy as to whether he was part of the operation to burn it or whether he was trying to rescue a soldier who was stuck inside and who was caught in the thing. But again, just to give you the social picture, his father would have been an alderman in Dublin Corporation at the time, member of Dublin, unionist member of Dublin City Council at the time. So these were the people who were in the British Army and serving in Ireland. On the 4th of November, the week after Terence McSweeney's death, was a very violent week in Tipperary. And the Nina IRA shot and killed Lieutenant Hamilton, who was an IO and the intelligence officer in the Northamptonshire Regiment outside Nina. And again, the reason I highlight this was the accounts of the troops going out of control, really, and how the difficulty the officers had in keeping them in control at that time. But the parish I come from, a place called Nye, two unfortunate people who were not prominent IRA men, but happened to have names similar to people who were thought to be IRA men, were arrested and were bayoneted to death in the back of the military lorry on their way back into the barrack that night. And again, one of them was an American citizen, gave rise to lots of very public controversy, really. In January 1921, the Mid-Tipperary ambushed military. And the reason I put this up, because it's worth bearing in mind, these people, while the army were professional soldiers, they were well armed, they had their machine guns, they had various other things. The people who were attacking them were IRA men with limited weaponry, limited ammunition, limited officers, without training. And it was, I suppose, quite extraordinary episodes, some of them, that took place. But again, just to highlight the official reprisals at that. So I'm just contrasting the two forces, really, how things worked. The military tactics, the main tactics were gathering intelligence, I suppose, and there's lots of stories told about that. They did these big searches, large-scale sweeps and roundups, and military officer, ex-military officer, who was RIC District Inspector in Newport, he was proposing an interesting technique. He was saying, no, we're going the wrong tactic here. We're not capturing the IRA men. What we need to do is like what we're supposed to do now in Northern Ireland. They put the SAS, you put the SAS out into a place, they lie in a ditch, they wait till the IRA come along, you ambush them, use their own tactics back on themselves. He was proposing that back in 1920 and 1921 as a way of dealing with IRA units in the hills between Newport to Thurles, all that area over there, interestingly enough. I don't think his men was particularly fond of taking up the idea that he had, but he certainly had the idea. Briefly, on the auxiliary division of the RIC, these people really deserve a separate study. We had two companies of them in Tipperary, B Company in Templemore, G Company in Ballina, Killaloo. This is a picture of G Company outside the Lakeside Hotel. Certainly these were officers, but not necessarily gentlemen, as in the understood sense of it at the beginning of the war. These, the old sort of Anglo-Irish and whatever, that class of officer was gone by the end of the war, they were wiped out. And these were replaced by people who came up through the ranks. And these were the people, a lot of them, who were involved in the auxiliaries after. They were, certainly in the Lakeside, they were drink-soaked and they were involved in controversy. And that's not my view or the Sinn Féin view, that's contemporary pamphlets written by people within their own. Ex-British civil servant who encountered them, who was retired in Ballina, wrote that particular piece. And clearly they were drink-soaked, huge amount of drinking going on. We have a Dublin Castle view on them as well, which they were involved in controversy with Dublin Castle, which gives us great records, no freedom of information restraints or anything like that. The stuff that's written about them is just wonderful stuff. They were under the command of a man called Major John Andrews, who was an interesting character, who had gone to fight the Bolsheviks and had been captured by the Bolsheviks, and was only a few months out when he came to take OC of the things in Ballina. And interestingly enough, one of the first things they did was to kill a set of prisoners on the bridge in Ballina. Another interesting character, some of you would be interested in, a man called George Nathan. We were talking about Kit Conway last night, who was killed in the Spanish Civil War. George Nathan was generally credited with being the man who shot Mayor Clancy and the people of Callahan and Clancy in Limerick, or certainly been part of the operation that did that. He was a member of G Company here in the piece, and he was killed after fighting in the Republican side in the Battle of Arama and the Spanish Civil War, George Nathan. So just, I said, they really are a study in themselves. Some Irish involved in the auxiliaries as well too. They were well armed and they were intended to intimidate. The photos were designed for that. They were armed to the teeth, their pump-action shotguns, their Lewis guns, and they didn't spare them when they were around Tipperary, certainly. Coming near the end now, some of the ex-soldiers shot as spies. Tipperary No. 1 Brigade didn't shoot any spies. The No. 2 Brigade shot 4, all of whom were ex-soldiers. No. 3 Brigade shot 8 people, I think 4 of those, I wouldn't swear to this one, I think 4 of the 8 were ex-soldiers. And the county inspectors commented after each of these killings induced a climate of fear, and you can imagine certainly they did. I've looked at a number of the cases in some detail. Patrick Maher was killed in Bursalee, coming up close to the truce, but really I think that the story with Maher, people who had fond of drink, you know, they were hanging around where the Tans were, and because the Tans had money, they were going to the pubs, they were drinking. Ex-soldiers were going in there, meeting them, getting drink bought for them, might have been passing marginal bits of information, but I think they were probably as much victims of the circumstances as they were. But the IRA were clearly going to keep that cut off, and the cases probably weren't hugely, they were all authorised at either Brigade OC level or by headquarters level, I think. But I'd say they were fairly indiscriminate, but they did have an effect. And so I think in Tipperary, my count was 8 ex-soldiers were shot. But I do think drink was a big part of the connection at the time. Then you had truce, treaty. This is Richmond Barracks with some of the mid-Tipperary guys move in as the troops move out. And all happened very quickly. From total war to February 1922, we had evacuation of the Army and the RIC out of Tipperary. Extraordinary turnaround, extraordinary result. Here's the Army marching out, never looking back, you know. The serving soldiers obviously went back to the mainland. The auxiliaries were disbanded. The RIC, some of them went to the RUC in Northern Ireland. Other RIC were disbanded and pensioned and returned home to Tipperary. But Tipperary was a tough place to be an ex-policeman, I can tell you. The Tipperary IRA, mid-Tipperary shot more people during this period than they did in the last 12 months of the War of Independence. So they were still settling scores, and we heard last night about John Cotter was shot in Phibsborough in Dublin, again following up and stuff. And there was terrible things happening. There was an ex-RIC man in May 1922, before the Civil War, inverted commas, had started. An ex-RIC man, John Walsh from Kerry, was shot by a group of IRA men in Newport, who I then think proceeded to give the day drinking in the town of Newport. And at some stage during the night they decided that there was another man, an ex-soldier called Galligan, who had been working and driving. And I think that they went at some stage during their drunken whatever and went down and pulled him out, or didn't quite pull him out, but shot him dead in front of his family as well. Again, pretty horrific sort of episodes really, but they certainly sent a message at the time and of the difficulty. And the RIC men who were in Tipperary, and I'd say a lot of ex-soldiers, scarpered very quickly out of Tipperary in May 1922 at that time, just before the start of the Civil War. Then you had the other end of the scale, the big houses. The big houses coming then. Carden's Abbey was burned in June 21. Well, that's very understandable. The company of auxiliaries had been there, so the day that the auxiliaries left, that was burned by the local IRA. Denali's was a big house in Kilboy, where the Ryans are now, the Tony Ryan GPA. They bought the remains of it. It's only a single-storey building now. That was burned in August 22. The gentry are probably worth a little bit of consideration, because many of the families, this is General Denali, there was 4 or 5 generals within, or ex-generals of the British Army. You know, practically every Anglo-Irish family had a colonel, a major, a captain or whatever in their ranks at the time. And they had been targets, and some were protected by their staff who were in the IRA. But they were left in a very difficult position when both the British Army and the RIC were gone in February of 1922. And they were cut very badly in the slide to anarchy, and a number fled obviously to the mainland and used the language of refugees. Denali headed an organisation in the UK talking about the condition of the Anglo-Irish in Tipperary, instancing the various stuff. And he wrote about that. But When these places were burned, that's just a picture of a relatively small house. Look at the number of people who were working, maybe 20, 25 people, 30 people working around these places. When they were burned, just like taking out small industries. The aftermaths for the soldiers, they were back in the lanes, towns of Tipperary, no unemployment, huge economic uncertainty. I would say quite a number joined the Free State Army. You had ex-servicemen's houses in the towns. There was a place called Flanders Lane or Flanders Avenue in Nina, where the ex-soldiers' towns. You had ex-servicemen's clubs and associations, and there's a monument in most of the towns. We will remember them if they're going down, the rising and going down. There surely was huge amounts of post-traumatic stress and suicide among the soldiers. Again, I don't have the figures, and it's one that would require a lot of research, but I suspect it was huge among them. The summary statistics, there's the population, how it was going down. 10,000 plus joined up during the war. Somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 killed during the Great War. Compare that with 152 killed in the War of Independence. 8 ex-soldiers killed as spies, and then others were killed during the Civil War period. So, in conclusion, that's a very quick review, Patsy, of the Great War and its aftermath in Tipperary. I say, forgotten story really, that Tipperary had such long and deep connections with the British Army. It really was the world brand, and I can't emphasise when the history, just how much the brand Tipperary was associated with the First World War. Whatever brand was dropped very quickly, it was dropped. Tipperary was a county divided in many ways. One group of Republicans were dominant at the end, and the ex-soldiers were silenced. It really is one of the untold social histories. Of maybe, I don't know how many hundred articles are in the Tipperary Historical Journal, there's about 4 about the British Army out of that whole, and there's none about this period that you have raised up here today. So I think really the theme that you've picked today really is a very appropriate one. In the weeks that the people were dying over here in Gallipoli, and in one morning in Gallipoli, 4 men from Tipperary were killed in one morning, alone in things. Little ones that are worth sort of bearing in mind. And as I say, compare the 150 killed in the War of Independence with probably about 10 times 1,500 killed during the Great War as well, too. Figures worth bearing in mind. Thank you very much.